In the unforgiving lands of the American West, where dust and desperation can obscure the sun, what is the price of a soul? In the middle of a dying cattle auction, an answer is given. A young woman, shackled by her own father, is sold off like broken goods. The world sees her as a castaway, a silent, stone-deaf creature, worthless. Stepping into this cruel scene is Silas Carrington, a lonely rancher, a man whose soul is as vast and desolate as the lands he rules. He came to buy a horse. He sirwanawar and him, but a single look from the girl changed everything. He paid not just for her freedom, but for her silence. But Silas didn't know that what he brought back to his ranch was not an empty silence. He had brought home a secret. He thought he had bought a deaf girl. He was wrong. She didn't listen with her ears, but with her heart, with her very soul. She heard the pain of creatures who could not speak. She heard the whisper of the wind before the storm. And most terrifying of all, she heard the silent scars, the unnamed grief in the soul of the very man who bought her. This is not a simple rescue story. This is a journey to discover that the quietest person can be the one who hears everything. It is a story of a connection born from a cruel transaction and of the truth that sometimes one must be lost in the deepest silence to finally be heard. Prepare yourself for Sold by Her Father, Bought by a Stranger, the deaf girl who heard it all. Texas, 1881. The late season sun was a hammer, beating down on the splintered bones of the market town and baking the dust into a fine, suffocating powder. It was the smell that hit you first. A thick, oppressive blend of livestock, sweat, and cheap whiskey, underscored by something sour and metallic, the scent of desperation. The last livestock auction of the autumn was winding down, its energy curdling in the oppressive heat. The auctioneer's voice, once a booming torrent, had dwindled to a hoarse, rhythmic patter. It sure interwined, but a ragged crowd of men still lingered, their faces hard-bitten, their eyes missing nothing. Silas Carrington stood apart from them, in the sliver of shade offered by the blacksmith's overhang. At 35, he was a man shaped by land and silence, his face a testament to the sun and wind, his hands calloused from work, not idleness. He rarely came to town. The noise felt like a violation, the forced pleasantries an exhausting lie. His ranch in Kiwanch, 200 acres of red Texas clay, bordered by fences he'd built with his own hands, was a silent kingdom. But the silence there had grown teeth over the years. It was no longer a comfort, but a cage of memory, haunted by ghosts he refused to name. He came to town not for company, but for a different kind of emptiness, a hollowness filled with the meaningless motion of others. He had come for a horse. He'd spotted the bay mare earlier that morning, standing hip-shot and trembling in a corner of the main corral. He circled back now as the bidding thinned for the last of the stock. She was a sorry sight, her ribs sharp beneath a dull hide, her flanks striped with the dried, cracked lines of old blood from a whip. Her head hung low, but it was her eyes that had caught him. They weren't broken. Not entirely. They were just waiting for the next blow, the next shout, the next indignity. It was a look he understood. As he approached the corral, his boot heels thudding a soft, deliberate rhythm against the packed clay, his gaze shifted. That was when he noticed her. She stood just behind the corral gate, so still she might have been mistaken for a shadow. A girl, no more than 19, though a hard life had attempted to carve more years onto her face. In her hair, the color of dusty straw, was matted to her cheek. Her dress, a shapeless sack of faded calico, was torn at the hem, revealing bare feet caked in dirt. She did not speak. She did not cry. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, wandered with a strange lack of focus, as if they were following the dance of dust motes in the air, or perhaps listening to something no one else could hear. Beside her, leaning heavily against a post, was a man whose stench preceded him. A bottle dangled from one hand, a length of rope from the other. The rope, thick and grimy, was not tied to an animal. It was looped around the girl's wrist. "Got a dumb one here," the drunk hollered to the disinterested audience of his own misery. "Came out of my first wife. I think she don't talk, don't hear neither." Nini Renards. He gave the rope a vicious tug, and the girl stumbled but made no sound. "But she cleans, cooks, pre-harnation. Don't sass." He grinned, revealing a landscape of broken, yellowed teeth. Cheap. A few of the nearby men chuckled darkly. A low, guttural sound of amusement that held no real humor. One spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground, narrowly missing the girl's bare feet. She didn't even flinch. A cold, hard knot formed in Silas's gut. He turned away, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. This was not his business. He was here for a horse, a simple transaction of coin for livestock. He would not be drawn into the sordid, messy lives of others. It was the first rule of his solitude, the one that kept the ghosts at bay. Do not get involved. But then he felt it. Not a voice, not a cry, just a glance. He couldn't say why he looked back, but he did. The girl was watching him. Her unfocused gaze had sharpened into a beam of startling intensity. There was no desperation in her face, no pleading in her posture. It was a look of pure, unvarnished recognition. It was as if, across the dusty, 10-yard expanse, her soul had looked directly into his and seen the same desolate landscape, the same profound and aching aloneness. In her eyes, he saw a mirror. The drunk, sensing a potential mark, stumbled closer, dragging the girl with him. "Yaku?" He snarled at Silas. "You got coin. Want the horse?" He gestured vaguely at the beaten-down mare. "She comes with it. I ain't dragging her back to the shack. Not worth the dust on her toes." Silas hesitated, his mind a war of instinct and reason. The mare pawed at the ground, blowing froth through her nostrils. The girl's gaze did not move from his face. It held him fast, a silent anchor in the swirling tide of his own indecision. To buy them was to invite complication. Whispers? Trouble. To walk away was to leave that look that's silent, knowing gaze to be extinguished by this brute. It was to betray a part of himself he didn't know still existed. He turned back, his own eyes as cold and hard as river stones, and looked the drunk squarely in the face. "I'll take both." The words hung in the hot, still air for a moment, and then the laughter from the nearby men erupted instant. Crude and sharp. "You buying livestock or starting a harem?" Silas. One called out, followed by a chorus of jeers. Silas ignored them. He was a man who had long ago stopped caring about the opinions of smaller men. He methodically counted coins into the drunk's grimy, outstretched hand. It was enough for a good horse, more than enough for the broken one in the corral. It was not nearly enough for a human soul, but it was all the man was asking. The drunk's eyes lit with greed. He yanked the rope hard. "Come on, girl!" The girl flinched violently, stumbling forward. But then she did something unexpected. She resisted. She dug her heels into the dirt and instinctively, irrevocably, stepped behind the solid wall of Silas's back. "She's yours now." The drunk slurred, pocketing the coins. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Ain't worth feeding." With a fluid motion, Silas reached out, untied the rough knot from the girl's wrist, and tossed the rope back at the man's feet. It landed in the dust with a soft, final thud. The red, raw chafe mark on her skin was a stark testament to her bondage. He said nothing to her. He simply turned and, with a quiet word, led the trembling mare out of the pen. He started toward his wagon, fully expecting to have to look back, to coax or command the girl to follow. He did not. She walked behind him, her steps soft but deliberate, a silent shadow matching his long strides. She carried nothing in her hands. No bundle, no possessions. She held only the thin, threadbare shawl draped over her shoulders as if it were a shield. When they reached his wagon, she stopped, waiting patiently, still utterly silent. He opened the back and motioned with his head for her to climb in. She did so without hesitation, folding herself into the far corner like someone long accustomed to making herself invisible, to taking up as little space in the world as possible. Silas secured the mare to the back and climbed up to the driver's bench. The weight of the day, of his decision, settling heavily upon him, he gathered the reins, ready to leave this town and its casual cruelty behind him. Then, he felt the faintest of tugs on the sleeve of his coat. He looked down, startled. Her fingers, small and calloused from work he could only imagine, had brushed his sleeve. It was a touch so light it was like the whisper of a moth's wing. There and then gone. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, hazy hills, on the open country that promised either freedom or a different kind of prison. In that single, fleeting touch, she He felt it all. She had not thanked him. She had not begged him. She had not cried. But she had acknowledged him. She had chosen Nursin and Awanemonism in that silent, profound moment to trust him. Silas Carrington, who spoke more with horses than with men, who lived alone with fences for company and scars he never named, snapped the reins. The wagon creaked forward, its wheels crunching over the hard-pan road, pulling them away from the noise and judgment of the town. Behind him, curled beneath a spare blanket he had tossed her, the girl sat with her face turned to the wind, letting it whip the straw-colored hair across her face. She never looked back. Neither did he. The journey back to Carrington Ranch stretched across 2 long days of dry plains and whispered wind. Silas rode ahead with the reins loose in his hand, and the girl Emmeline, though he did not yet know her name, sat quietly in the back of the wagon, legs drawn up, arms around her knees. The trail dust clung to both of them, but neither complained. Not that she could, he supposed. Still, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was curious, uncertain, like the moment before a thunderclap. She hadn't spoken once since the auction. Not a word, not even a noise. Some men might have found that eerie, unsettling, but Silas had grown accustomed to silence. After all, silence had been his only company for years, ever since the war took his brothers and the ranch took what was left of his family. There were days the only thing he heard was the creak of a saddle or the crunch of dry grass under boot. They camped beneath a canopy of stars the first night. Silas built a small fire and boiled beans in a dented tin pot. He didn't ask her if she was hungry. He simply set a bowl next to her, along with a canteen of water, and returned to his side of the fire. She ate quietly, sparingly, never once making eye contact. But once, just once, he caught her glancing at him, her eyes flickering with something unreadable suspicion. Perhaps, or maybe just weariness. When the fire died low, he gestured to the bedroll he had laid out for her near the wagon wheel. She didn't respond, not even a nod. But a moment later, she rose, moving as fluidly and carefully as if afraid to make a sound. She lay down, back to him, and pulled the thin blanket over her shoulders. Silas didn't sleep well. He lay under the stars, the rifle close, listening for coyotes or worse men with bad intentions. But all he heard was the whisper of wind and, once, the smallest sound so faint he thought he imagined it. A whimper, perhaps, or the sound of someone quietly crying into a blanket, trying to be strong. They reached the ranch late the next day. It was nothing much to look at: 300 acres of brittle land dotted with mesquite and sage, a windmill that groaned like an old man, and a house that leaned slightly south from a storm 10 years past. But it was home, and it was hers now, too, at least for the time being. He helped her down from the wagon, surprised when she took his hand without hesitation. Her fingers were smaller than he expected, warm despite the dust. When her boots hit the ground, she looked around slowly, taking in the barn, the corral, the empty chicken coop. "It ain't fancy," Silas said, not expecting a reply. "But the roof holds, and the well's clean." She walked ahead of him into the house. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with cedar and old tobacco. The main room held a hearth, a pinewood table, and 2 mismatched chairs. He watched as she moved through it, her fingers brushing the edge of the mantel, pausing to straighten a crooked tin-frame photograph. A woman and 3 boys, his mother and brothers. All gone now. He cleared his throat. "That one on the left's Daniel. My twin, one to minimum, one more." She looked at him, eyes lingering on the photo. Then at Silas, her gaze softened slightly. He nodded toward the back. "There's a spare room. It used to be my ma's sewing room. Got a small bed, a window. You can sleep there." Again, no nod, no response. But she turned and walked back, her steps sure. That night, Silas sat on the porch with his boots off and a pipe unlit in his hand. He didn't smoke anymore. Hadn't in years. But sometimes he liked the feel of it in his fingers. Made the silence feel less empty. The door creaked open. He turned slightly and saw her standing there. She held something in her hand, an old piece of chalk, from where he didn't know, but she moved to the side of the doorframe and began to write. One word. Letters careful. A little shaky. "Emmeline." Silas stared at it a long moment. "That's your name." She looked at him. A beat passed. Then, barely visible, a single nod. He smiled. slow and genuine. Well then, Derser Surens, welcome home. Emmeline, mit Derserterman, Silverin, Dabrinum. The next morning dawned red and windless. Silas rose early, as always, and headed out to the corral. The bay gelding he'd bought, same deal as Emmeline, was tethered under the oak tree. The animal had been whipped, neglected. Scars marked its flank, and its right eye was cloudy with old pain. Silas approached carefully. The gelding snorted and backed away. Easy now, he murmured. Ain't no one here to hurt you. Behind him, footsteps. Light widow Silbernebu. Barely there. He turned to find Emmeline walking barefoot through the dewy grass, her hair unbound, face unreadable. You ought to be resting, he said gently. Still got road dust on your soul. She didn't stop. Didn't even look at him. Instead, she walked to the fence, slipped between the rails, and slowly, deliberately, approached the horse. Silas took a step forward. Be careful, he's been... But she raised one hand without turning around. A small and tenir rinmasen. Decisive gesture. A pause. Then, went to Martinum. Slowly, she reached out. The gelding snorted, shifted. For a moment, it looked like he might bolt. But Emmeline didn't flinch. She stood there, calm as dusk, one hand hovering just inches from the horse's nose. Then, like a blessing, the animal lowered its head. She touched it gently, fingers brushing the scarred skin. The gelding let out a breath and leaned into her. Silas stood there, jaw slightly slack. She placed her hand on the horse's chest, closed her eyes, and stood still. Minutes passed. When she opened her eyes again, the gelding was breathing slow and deep. He was calm, like he'd found something familiar in her, something safe. Silas approached slowly. I'll be damned. She stepped back and looked at him, then pointed to her chest. He blinked. You understand them. She touched her fingers to her temple, then made a motion in the air like wind moving across a plain. Silas didn't fully understand, but the meaning settled into his chest all the same. She felt what they felt. Somehow, as if their hurt whispered something only she could hear. The rest of the day passed in quiet work. Emmeline moved through the house with practiced ease, sweeping floors, washing old dishes, feeding the chickens with a rhythm like she'd always lived there. Silas tried not to stare, but he couldn't help it. She didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't demand. She just did, as though doing was the only language she trusted. That night, over beans and cornbread, Silas placed a small slate and a piece of chalk on the table. For when you want to talk, he said. She glanced at it, then at him, and after a moment, she picked up the chalk and wrote, Thank you. Silas swallowed. Ain't done nothing worth thanking yet. She paused, then wrote, You didn't ask what was wrong with me. Silas looked at the words a long time. I reckon I figured there was more right with you than folks give you credit for. That night, one and one, as she stood near the hearth brushing her hair, Emmeline caught Silas watching. Not with hunger, not with pity, but with something softer, something uncertain. When she returned to her room, she looked at the name she had written on the doorframe. Her name, and traced it once with her fingertip. A name spoken in silence was still a name. A home found in quiet was still a home. And this place, Kasiburni, for the first time in years, felt like something new, a beginning. The Texas sun rose slow and golden the next morning, casting long fingers of light across the wide, empty horizon. At the Carrington Ranch, the world stirred gently. A rooster crowed, cows lowed from the corral, and a soft wind rattled the brittle stalks of late summer grass. Silas Carrington stood at the porch rail, sipping black coffee, his gaze drawn instinctively to the lone figure moving across the yard. Emmeline. She wore the same blue calico dress she'd arrived in, the hem slightly torn where it had caught on a wagon wheel. Her dark hair was tied back with a thin scrap of cloth, and her bare feet kicked up puffs of dust as she moved. She wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just walking slowly, trailing her fingers along the weathered fence rail like she was listening through her skin. He'd seen it more than once now. That peculiar way she oriented herself, pausing, tilting her head, turning towards something that wasn't there. She didn't just move through space, she seemed to read it, understand it. Silas set the cup down on the rail. He wasn't a man given to superstition. Life had taught him that most things that couldn't be explained didn't need to be. But watching Emmeline in the yard, her slender hands open to the wind, He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. Something beyond sense and speech. He crossed the porch steps slowly. She didn't look up, didn't flinch when his boots crunched on the gravel. She stopped in front of the barn and turned her face toward the sky. Then was sorting arm went. Without warning, she whirled around and gestured to him fast. Urgent. Her hands formed shapes in the air, her eyes wide. She pointed toward the small tool shed at the edge of the yard and shook her head violently. Then again point. Shake Tony May Turner. Point. Shake. He asked. He didn't expect an answer. But the fear in her posture tightened his chest. She darted to the edge of the porch, grabbed the stub of charcoal he kept by the ledger board, and scrawled a message on the porch wall. Don't go to the shed, please. What the hell? Before he could finish the sentence, a sound split the morning, a sudden, sharp crack, like the sky tearing open. Then the world went white. The bolt of lightning struck the tool shed with the sound of cannon fire. Wood splintered. Smoke bloomed. For a moment, the yard was filled with the acrid scent of burned cedar and ozone. Silas fell backward, shielding his eyes, his ears ringing. When he looked up again, the shed was gone. A smoking heap remained where it had stood, a twisted mass of scorched timber and ash. And Emmeline was still there, standing calm in the yard, arms at her sides, breathing hard. Silas stared at her in disbelief. His heart thudded hard in his ribs, not from the lightning, not even from the wreckage. From her, you knew in one ounce, he whispered. She didn't respond, didn't smile. She just walked past him, into the house. Her shoulders trembling ever so slightly. Mom. Later, he found her in the kitchen, pouring water from the pump into a chipped tin cup. Her hands were steady now, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Silas leaned in the doorway, watching her. That shed, he said quietly, was struck clean out of nowhere. Sky was blue, not a cloud. And yet, he trailed off. She set the cup down and picked up her slate, wrote one word, wind. He frowned. The wind, she nodded. Then slowly. Tinana, she wrote more. Wind talks, not loud, but I hear it. He stared at the sentence, his skin crawling not with fear, but with awe. She wiped the slate clean and wrote again. It changes before danger, like breath before shouting. He swallowed hard. That's why you stopped me. She nodded. Silas exhaled slowly and crossed the room. She stood stiff as a board, her back against the counter. He took the slate from her hands and laid it down gently. You saved my life, he said, and you did it without saying a single word. He didn't touch her. Didn't need to. She relaxed, just slightly. A tremor passed through her, as if something tight inside her had finally let go. Yeah. Over the next few days, the ranch shifted in subtle ways. Silas became more careful in her presence, not out of fear but respect. He noticed how she would freeze in the yard just before a dust devil spun up across the hill, how she pulled the barn door shut a minute before a cold wind blew in from the north, how she paused at the hen house one evening, knelt, and pulled out a hidden snake before it could bite one of the laying hens. Emmeline never explained herself. She didn't try to prove anything. But over time, Silas stopped doubting. Her gift, whatever it was, had saved him once, and he'd be a fool not to trust it again. One night, he found her sitting under the tree behind the barn, the sky above her a river of stars. She was sketching in the dirt with a stick, something circular, maybe a wind pattern, maybe nothing. He didn't interrupt, just sat beside her in the dry grass and looked up at the sky with her. The silence stretched long between them. Eventually, he asked softly, how long have you been like this? She didn't write anything. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a smooth, flat stone with a small fossil imprint, an ammonite spiral etched into the surface. She held it out to him. He turned it over in his palm. Found this as how to son. She nodded, then took the slate and wrote, I found it the day after my mother died. The wind was strange. I listened, and I knew when in Silas looked at her, at the steady lines of her face, the quiet strength behind her eyes. And the others, your father, they never listened. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. He handed the fossil back. I don't know what this is, he said softly, but I know a miracle when I see one. She turned toward him, then, just slightly, and for the first time since they'd met, Her expression changed not just a flicker of gratitude or curiosity, but a full, real smile. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Um, the next day, a peddler passed through, dragging a wagon full of dry goods. Silas bartered 2 chickens and a small tin of honey for a new slate, smoother and larger than the old one, and a tin box full of colored chalks. He didn't make a fuss about it, just left it on the table. That night, Emmeline used green chalk to draw a crude sketch of a hawk diving from the sky. Silas didn't say much, just nodded once and said, "That's fine work." She left the drawing on the table. He didn't wipe it away. That week, a change settled between them. Silas still rose early to tend to the livestock. Emmeline still kept mostly to herself. But there was now a rhythm to the silence, a familiarity. They moved around each other not like strangers, but like people who understood the shape of each other's footsteps. One afternoon, when he returned from mending fence posts on the west field, he found a note on the porch bench. It read, "Storm coming tomorrow. Gather the chickens in early. Leave the east corral open." Sure enough, by nightfall the next day, the wind had shifted, heavy with rain. The downpour lasted only an hour, but the creek flooded high. The animals were safe. The damage was minimal. He found her later near the fireplace, watching the flames. "You're not deaf," he said gently. She looked up. "You hear the world in a way no one else does." Her eyes shimmered in the firelight. "I think," he paused, searching for the right words. "I think I was half deaf before you came here. Deaf to things that matter, to things that don't shout but whisper." She stood slowly, walked to the mantel, and took a piece of chalk from the tin. In neat, careful letters, she wrote on the wall above the hearth, "Sometimes the world doesn't shout because it wants you to lean in." Silas stared at it, then at her. He nodded once. "Then I'll keep listening." Outside, the wind sighed low through the trees, gentle and knowing, like it had always been waiting for someone to hear. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows of the ranch house, casting long golden beams across the floorboards. Outside, a breeze stirred the prairie grass. But inside, the air was heavy with the silence that often followed hard work and old grief. Silas Carrington sat at the kitchen table, boots dusty, eyes distant, staring into a cup of cold coffee he'd forgotten to drink. Emmeline moved about the room with her quiet grace, her bare feet barely making a sound on the wood. She was gathering herbs she'd hung to dry over the hearth yarrow, sagar, weshshotki, and lavender, suriyuri, in permuisun. She placed them into small cotton pouches, labeling them carefully in her neat, looping script. She had taken to keeping a small slate tucked into her apron pocket to communicate with Silas when needed. But often, she didn't need it. They understood each other in the space between words. Today, though, Silas had been quieter than usual. Emmeline had noticed the way he avoided looking at the small shelf above the fireplace, the one that held a cracked photograph of 2 young boys, one with a gap-toothed grin and a crooked hat, the same boys who'd once run through this ranch house, playing tag with barking dogs and dreams too big for the fences. That morning, a peddler had passed through, offering trade goods and gossip. Emmeline had stepped out to feed the hens, and when she returned, Silas was gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. The peddler had mentioned a name, Daniel Carrington. It must have hit something deep. She didn't ask. She never had to. That evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, Silas rose from his chair without a word and walked into the adjoining room, the one that had remained closed since the day Emmeline arrived. It was his brother's old room, or so she'd guessed. He hadn't spoken of it, nor had he let her clean it. Now, antamasurtum. The door creaked open on a long breath of dust and memory. Emmeline waited a few minutes. Then she followed. The room was small, untouched by time. A quilt folded neatly on the bed, a pair of worn boots beneath it. On the desk rested a tarnished harmonica, and above it hung a lopsided horseshoe nailed into the wall. Silas stood at the window, shoulders tense, jaw tight. He didn't turn when she entered. Emmeline stepped softly toward the chest at the foot of the bed. Her hands hovered above it, uncertain. "Don't," Silas said, his voice hoarse. But it wasn't anger, just the brittle edge of sorrow. Long buried, she hesitated, then lowered herself beside it anyway. Her fingers brushed the latch. She felt something else, not just sadness, but something pleading. It wasn't coming from him. Not exactly. It came from the silence between them. She opened it. Inside were a few folded shirts, a child's drawing in fading crayon, and a small velvet pouch. Emmeline opened the pouch slowly. Out spilled a delicate gold chain, at the end of which dangled a locket no bigger than a thimble. She flipped it open. Inside, a photo of two boys, again, Daniel and Silas. And beside them, a woman with eyes like Silas's, his mother. Silas didn't move, but Emmeline felt something crack in the air, like a frozen pond giving under weight. She rose and placed the locket on the windowsill beside him. I was 12, he said after a long pause. When she gave me that nakadiyanum, Mama told me to keep it close, said it would remind me where I come from. Daniel, he laughed, said he didn't need any jewelry to remember. His voice faltered. I kept it after she died. Then Daniel died too. And I put it all in here and shut the lid. Thought if I didn't see it, it wouldn't hurt. Emmeline didn't respond. Instead, she reached for the slate and wrote a single word. Wad. Because I failed him, Silas said. He was supposed to leave for Galveston that day, headed for the coast, to take a job building rail lines. I was the one who told him to wait, that I needed his help patching the roof first. He stayed. That night he went to town alone. Didn't come back. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. They said it was a robbery. Wrong place. Wrong time. But I always felt it was me, that I anchored him here. The room was silent again. Then Emmeline stepped forward and did something she hadn't done before. She reached up and laid her hand gently over his heart. He looked down at her, surprised. She pressed her palm softly, firmly right over the place that hurt most. Then she stepped back and walked out of the room. A minute later, she returned not with the slate, but with something unexpected. From beneath her mattress, she pulled a small music box she had never shown before. The lacquered surface was worn, but its tiny brass key still turned. She set it down and cranked it gently. A haunting tune floated out, soft and trembling. It wasn't cheerful. It was the kind of melody that remembered things. As the music played, Emmeline returned to the window and placed her hand back on his chest. This time, Silas reached up and held it there, his eyes closed. I haven't spoken his name out loud in 6 years, he murmured. But somehow, you knew. She stepped back again and wrote on the slate. I didn't hear it. I felt it. That night, Silas sat by the fire long after Emmeline had gone to bed. He turned the locket over in his fingers again and again, watching the flame's reflection flicker in the polished gold. For the first time since Daniel's death, the house didn't feel like a tomb. The next morning, Emmeline left early to collect herbs by the riverbank. When she returned, something was different in the main room. Above the hearth, Warnawuri, Surman, and Wesumarn. Beside the old photo of the boys, now hung the locket carefully hooked over a small nail, and next to it, a new item, a faded ribbon with the name Daniel stitched into the edge in boyish thread. She turned toward Silas, who stood at the stove turning flapjacks with one hand. He didn't say anything. He just offered her the first one off the pan. Golden brown and steaming, she smiled and nodded her thanks. They ate in silence. From when I saw him, but that silence had changed. It was no longer an emptiness. It was a knowing. The sun broke over the Carrington Ranch in pale ribbons, casting long shadows across the scorched earth and half-burnt fence posts. The land was still healing from the fire, and so were its occupants. Silas had taken to checking the perimeter early every morning, rifle slung across his back, boots crunching dry gravel. Emmeline followed silently some days, sometimes scribbling notes about a broken hinge or tracks near the waterline. There was a rhythm between them, now unspoken, but no longer uncertain. Their bond had deepened. Rooted in the night, they had defended the ranch together, in sweat and smoke and danger. But danger wasn't done with them yet. It began with a fever. A boy from town, Matthew, the son of the livery stableman, was struck down with sudden sickness. Burning hot, he lay in bed with a pulse like a hammer and lips cracked from thirst. The doctor had gone to San Antonio for supplies, and the town's folk remedies failed to make a dent in the boy's condition. By the second night, fear crept through the dusty streets of Dry Creek. Whispers bloomed like weeds. Plague. Cursed thorn. Cursed land. Punishment. Someone even muttered. Witchery. And it didn't take long before those whispers turned toward Emmeline. She ain't right, muttered Withers, the blacksmith with a crooked mouth and a long memory. She knew that lightning was coming, knew where folks were in the dark, And she don't speak, don't hear, but still knows things. Carrington's bewitched. Westferosin, Saratin. Another added, look at Pim, changed overnight. They burned witches in Salem. A third said darkly, should have stayed tradition. Silas caught wind of it from Jonah, the old apothecary who still owed him favors from cattle seasons long past. And they're stirring. Silas horns. See, can't say how far it'll go. Silas didn't answer. He just nodded and rode home faster than usual. Dust cloud trailing like smoke. When he told Emmeline, she said nothing, but her slate bore a single word. Expected. That night, Silas barely slept. He sat by the fire. But Kiran shotgun leaning against the wall, watching the flames lick the inside of the hearth. Emmeline sat nearby, hands busy sorting herbs, laying them in neat piles along a cloth. Rosemary, yarrow, willow bark. Her fingers moved without hesitation. What are you doing? He asked, voice quiet. She tilted her head, then pointed to one pile and tapped out letters on her slate. For fever. The boy. He asked. She nodded. You really think you can help? She looked him full in the face, then eyes steady. The dark, unreadable. She didn't nod this time. Instead, she stood and took a jar from the top shelf. Inside were dried honeysuckle blossoms, sweet-smelling, faintly golden. She crushed them gently in her palm and added them to a pouch. An hour before dawn, Emmeline wrapped the herbs in cloth and slipped out of the house. Silas followed without a word, tension radiating from his shoulders like heat off the land. When they reached Dry Creek, the streets were near empty. Most folk were either asleep or keeping watch over the sick child. Silas led the way to the stableman's house. The man Tom opened the door wide-eyed and wild. He's worse, he rasped. God. Silas. He's not responding to water or anything. This is Emmeline. Silas cut in. Let her see the boy. Tom blinked. She's the one folks been talking about. Let her see him. The man stepped aside. Inside the dark room, the air reeked of sour breath and old sweat. The boy lay twitching, murmuring in a delirious stupor. His skin glistened with sweat, chest rattling like a broken music box. Emmeline moved like a ghost. She bent low, feeling his forehead, his pulse. Her hands worked swiftly, efficient, and a wankenchurn with Cernashurnasurn. From her bag, she pulled her pouch of herbs and brewed them into a tea using water warmed over a nearby lantern flame. She tapped Silas's arm and pointed. Tilt his head. Silas obeyed, cradling the boy as Emmeline poured the mixture into his mouth, drop by drop. Then she soaked a cloth in cold water, added a few crushed mint leaves, and laid it on the child's brow. No one spoke. Then the boy let out a long sigh, and his twitching ceased. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough. Silas and Emmeline stayed another hour, watching as the boy's breathing slowed into something steady. His skin cooled. His lips lost their dusky color. Tom sat down hard on a stool and began to cry. Thank you, he whispered. When word spread that Emmeline had saved the stableman's boy, the reaction wasn't what Silas hoped. It should have been relief, celebration, even, but instead, people whispered louder than ever, because what they feared most wasn't her silence. It was her power. Withers returned the next night. Not alone. He brought 4 men armed, grim-faced and banged on the Carrington door like a judge calling for execution. Silas opened it with his rifle already in hand. She's got no business here, Withers barked. Ain't natural. Saving a boy the doc couldn't. Knowing when lightning strikes, she's a danger. She's a blessing. Silas shot back. You want to call her a witch? She's a healer. Saved your own townsman's boy. Did any of you manage that? One of the men behind Withers wavered. Another looked at the ground. But Withers stood firm. She goes, or things get ugly. It was Emmeline who answered without a word. She stepped forward, calm as still water, and looked Withers straight in the eyes. Then she pulled out her slate and scratched something slowly, deliberately. Truth is louder than fear. Then she handed it to Withers. He read it. His lip curled, but he didn't speak. Instead, he turned and walked back down the porch steps. The others followed. Silas turned to Emmeline, heart still racing. What made you write that? She gave him the smallest smile, then turned the slate to show him another line. Written just beneath the first or, you believed it first. Silas said nothing, but his throat tightened. Later that night, he found her on the porch, watching the stars. The barn still smelled faintly of ash, but the wind was warm and gentle now. He sat beside her, and she leaned just slightly into his shoulder. In the silence, she picked up her slate and began to write again. "They'll come again, but not yet." Silas looked at the message. Then at the woman beside him the girl once sold as broken, now feared because she wasn't. "Then we'll be ready," he said quietly. And in that moment, he didn't care if the whole damn town thought she was a witch or a miracle. To him, she was both and more. She was the sound he hadn't known he'd been listening for his whole life. Night fell heavy over the Carrington Ranch. A sky thick with stars stretched above the quiet plains of Texas. The wind had picked up, whispering uneasily through the tall grass, rattling the shutters on the ranch house. Inside, Silas sat at the kitchen table, oil lamp burning low, his brow furrowed over a map of his property. Emmeline was nearby, silently sweeping the hearth, the fire casting soft flickers against her face. For days now, tension had hung in the air like a storm that wouldn't break. Ever since the confrontation in town, Silas had kept a rifle propped behind the front door. They'd returned from Wither's accusation bruised but unbowed. But even Emmeline's calm presence hadn't eased his growing sense of unease. He couldn't say why. Exactly, perhaps it was the way the townsfolk had looked at her, or the shame in Wither's eyes when Silas had stood tall for her. Shame could turn to rage faster than a spark to dry brush. Emmeline paused in her sweeping, her head tilted slightly. As though listening, Silas noticed. "What is it?" he asked, rising slowly from his chair. She didn't answer, but her eyes shifted to the window. A flicker of light, too orange, too wild, broke through the darkness outside. Silas crossed the room in 2 strides and flung open the door. The barn was on fire. Flames licked the dark sky, roaring up from the roof like a demon released. Sparks flew into the air, carried by the wind across the dry yard. The animals inside the horses, the mule, the chickens were screaming in panic. "God Almighty," Silas muttered, grabbing his rifle and racing outside. Emmeline was already behind him. Her skirts lifted slightly as she ran barefoot across the dirt. But before they could reach the barn, voices echoed from the tree line. Silas's blood froze. Shadows moved 5, maybe 6 men, masked by scarves, advancing with guns drawn. "Back off, Carrington." And one of them barked. "Let the fire do its work." Silas raised his rifle. "You cowards come to burn what you're too small to understand." A shot rang out, striking the dirt near his feet. Silas ducked, returning fire instinctively. He pulled Emmeline behind the water trough, heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't just a threat, it was an ambush. Emmeline tapped his arm and held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the east side of the yard. She tapped her chest and gestured she would flank them. Silas shook his head violently. "No, doctor." "Emmeline, this is sure you wanted to know. They'll kill you." But her gaze was steady, unblinking. Her gift, whatever it truly was, had always given her a sense of people's movement. Somehow was her center. She could feel them even in the dark. He had seen it before. He clenched his jaw and nodded once. She was gone in a blink. Silas laid down covering fire, forcing the men to scatter and duck. Another shot whistled past his ear. The barn groaned. Flames bursting through the upper rafters. The terrified whinnies of his horses nearly tore his heart open. But he had no choice. The fight came first. Then Mrisurshuritin. From the east, a shotgun boomed. One of the masked men cried out, collapsing in the dirt. Confusion broke through the others. A second blast came. This one closer. Emmeline's silhouette moved like a shadow, silent, swift. She had taken the long way around and was now behind them. Another man ran. Silas took down a 4th with a well-aimed shot to the shoulder. The remaining attackers turned and bolted, disappearing into the night, leaving the barn ablaze and 2 men moaning in the dirt. Silas sprinted toward the barn, with Emmeline's help. They managed to swing the side door open. The heat hit them like a wall. Inside, smoke choked the air, but the horses were still alive, panicked, wild-eyed. One by one, Silas led them out, coughing, eyes stinging. Emmeline held their reins, whispering silently, calming them. By the time they emerged, the roof gave way with a crash of sparks and timber. The barn was lost. They stood there, panting, faces streaked with soot, illuminated by the last of the fire's angry glow. Behind them, the 2 injured attackers had vanished, likely dragged off by their companions. Silas turned to Emmeline. Her hair was wild with ash. Her hands burned and blackened, but her eyes were calm, unshaken. She had saved his life again. And more than that, she had defended this place as fiercely as if it were her own. He reached out and took her hands gently. Amafi, I don't have words. Emmeline, Hukurnenewam, Purrimon. She reached up, brushed his cheek with a soot-streaked thumb, then stepped forward and rested her forehead against his. No words were needed. Later, they sat on the porch in silence, wrapped in a blanket, watching the embers cool. The ranch was scarred, but still standing, and so were they. The sound of fire had come, furious and full of hate, but the silence that followed, it belonged to them hard-earned and unbreakable. The morning after the fire, the ranch was a ruin of ash and quiet. Smoke rose in lazy spirals from the scorched remains of the barn, a black skeleton against the pale dawn. Silas Carrington stood beside the broken fence line, his face drawn tight with fatigue and soot, his coat torn and streaked with blood. Emmeline stood just behind him, her face smudged but calm, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting the mob to return. They had survived, but at what cost? Silas rubbed a hand over his beard, the weight of what had happened settling on his shoulders like a yoke. The barn was gone. Half the livestock had fled into the night, and the other half, terrified, huddled in the eastern paddock, still too frightened to eat. He turned toward Emmeline, who now knelt beside a charred beam, brushing ash away with her fingers. She wasn't looking at the destruction with sorrow. She was assessing. We'll rebuild, he said hoarsely. She looked up at him and nodded. They didn't speak of what had happened. Not directly. Not of how she's silent. Underestimated. Death had used her uncanny awareness to flank a mob in the night, firing a warning shot that sent armed men running like startled cattle. Silas had seen many things in war, in grief, and in death, but nothing had stunned him more than the sight of Emmeline. Emerging from the smoke like a wraith with a shotgun in her hands, the sun rose slow that morning, its light catching the remnants of the fire, gilding ruin with reluctant gold. Word traveled quickly. By midday, the sheriff arrived, grim-faced and silent. He said little, and I only surveyed the damage with a glance and a grunt. Trouble's not over, he finally muttered. Silas stiffened. They coming back. Doubt it. The sheriff said, not after what she did. Word is, most of 'em ain't slept since. But there's something else. He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. We got a boy missing. 8-year-old T, son of that stubborn fool Jenkins, went missing last night. Silas frowned. He was here with the mob. The sheriff didn't answer. Emmeline had already turned her head, her expression changing, focused and intense. Silas saw it happen, that flicker, like a wind moving through tall grass. She didn't move her lips, but she touched Silas's sleeve and pointed eastward, toward the ridge beyond the river. What is it? He asked softly. She stepped away, grabbed the slate hanging near the back door, and scribbled a single word. There. The sheriff stared at her. You saying you know where he is? She nodded. How? She erased the slate and wrote, I hear different. The sheriff looked between her and Silas, clearly torn between disbelief and desperation. Well, then lead the way. The search party followed Emmeline across the riverbed and through a tangle of mesquite and deadfall. She moved quickly, with no hesitation, stopping once to crouch and place her palm against the soil. Then she pointed toward a thicket of brush near an old mining shed. They found the boy curled beneath a felled pine tree, dehydrated, with a gash on his forehead and a broken leg. But alive, Silas carried him back to town with the sheriff trailing behind. Emmeline walked ahead, her stride even and silent. And when they reached the square, the crowd parted like waves. Mothers gasped. Men removed their hats. Jenkins stumbled forward, grabbing his boy from Silas's arms and sobbing openly. Then the man everyone least expected stepped forward. Withers. The mob's leader, his bruised pride still showed in the scab on his cheek. He removed his hat and held it in both hands. Miss Emmeline, he said, his voice low. I came here 2 nights ago with poison in my heart. I thought I was protecting my town. But I see now, I was burning what made it worth saving. He looked to Silas. Whatever justice you ask, name it. Silas glanced at Emmeline. She stood utterly still, but her eyes met his with quiet resolve. He turned back to Withers. You want to make this right, then rebuild the barn. All of you, every man who rode here with fire in his hands. The murmurs grew. One man swore under his breath. Another looked away. But Withers straightened. We'll do it. If right. And they did. For weeks, the town labored. Men who had thrown rocks now carried lumber. Boys who had cheered the burning now hauled water and nails. Emmeline oversaw it all with silent grace, sketching barn plans on slate, adjusting timbers with chalk lines and silent gestures. It was not just a barn that rose from the ashes. It was a symbol of forgiveness, of faith, tenermanafornta, of something deeper than fear or suspicion. The women came too. They brought food. Some brought fabric and helped Emmeline stitch curtains for the new barn's loft windows. They did not speak much, but they watched her, and they began to smile. One afternoon, the town preacher approached Silas as he drove a post deep into the new foundation. "She saved that boy," the preacher said, "and saved your life too. She did what it was." Silas replied simply. The preacher looked toward Emmeline, who was helping a small girl balance a pail of nails. Maybe it's time this town started listening to the quiet folk. When the barn was finished, the townspeople gathered to celebrate. There was no formal speech, no parade. Just a long table set with bread and beans, and music from a fiddle played by a teenager who had once jeered at Emmeline behind her back. That night, Silas and Emmeline stood beneath the loft window. The wind blew cool across the plains. Above them, stars stretched like scattered silver. He turned to her. "You didn't just save me, Emmeline. You saved all of us." She shook her head, then reached for her slate. "We saved each other." He watched her write, the flicker of the lantern dancing on her face. Then he touched her wrist. "I don't need the slate," he said softly. "I hear you just fine." And for the first time, Emmeline smiled wide and real. She set the slate down and stepped into his arms. In the distance, the new barn stood solid and proud against the prairie, built not by blood or fear, but by atonement. And beneath that same sky, a ranch once threatened by fire and fear became something new. A home, a hope, a place where love could speak, even without sound. The wind had grown gentle again by the time the last beam was lifted into place. Late spring sunlight glinted off the newly raised barn, its pine boards still raw and golden, and the smell of cut timber lingered like incense in the air. The entire town had come to witness its completion. Though no official invitation had been sent, they came with calloused hands, quiet apologies, and tools slung over shoulders as if to prove penance. No one spoke of the fire that had torn down the old structure. It was not denial, but reverence. Silas stood near the open double doors, sweat streaking his temple, one hand resting on his hip as he watched the final nails driven in. Emmeline was nearby, sleeves rolled to her elbows, holding a small hammer in one hand and a hand-stitched apron smeared with paint and sawdust tied loosely around her waist. She looked every bit a rancher now, every bit a part of this land. And this time, when people looked at her, they didn't see a strange girl who whispered to the wind. They saw the girl who saved the sheriff's boy, who had walked through fire. It had taken months longer than they thought, but bit by bit, the lines between her and the town began to blur. Children no longer pointed. Men tipped their hats. Women who once crossed the street to avoid her now brought her marmalade and asked her about herbs. Some still whispered behind hands, but even those voices softened when their fields healed under her advice. That morning, Emmeline had awakened to find a bouquet of wildflowers on the porch, wrapped in newspaper and tied with twine. No name, no known, that Sibrimar, but she didn't need one. The town was finally speaking back in its own halting, earnest way. Silas still rose early, his footsteps creaking across the floorboards just before sunrise. And each morning, Emmeline was already awake. She had always been up before him. She moved through the house with the grace of someone who had lived there forever. It no longer felt borrowed. It was her home. The new barn wasn't the only thing taking shape. The house had changed too. A new shelf had been installed in the kitchen, just beneath the window, holding Emmeline's small collection of dried herbs and field guides. Next to the door, a slate board hung, bearing messages in chalk, some practical, some sweet. Silas had taken to writing notes even when he spoke aloud. It became their ritual. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars blinked through, Emmeline stood on the porch holding 2 tin cups of chicory coffee. Silas joined her, his hat tipped back, boots caked in mud. "Barn looks good," he said simply. Emmeline nodded and handed him a cup. She didn't write anything on the slate, nor gesture. She just stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "I never thought it'd feel like this," he said after a while. She tilted her head. Peaceful. She smiled, eyes crinkling. Her fingers brushed his lightly. That night, Emmeline sat beside Luna, yes, the little girl from the sheriff's house, now attached to her like a barn kitten. They read from an old storybook by the light of an oil lamp. And Silas, sitting at the table sharpening tools, watched the scene with a quiet ache of gratitude. It was then he reached into the top drawer, pulling out a small box wrapped in red cloth. He turned it over in his hand, hesitating. Then he set it down on the table, as if testing its weight. Emmeline saw him. The next morning, they walked together through the pastures, her arm looped through his, neither of them speaking. The sun warmed the tall grass, and bluebirds darted between fence posts. Finally, they stopped near the stream. I reckon, Silas said, rubbing the back of his neck. We ought to stop pretending we ain't already something more. Emmeline looked at him, not startled, just waiting. I bought you, he added quietly. That day at the sale, that ain't a thing I can ever make right. But everything since, she reached up and touched his chest, right above his heart. Then she took his hand and pressed it to hers. He understood. I'd like to marry you, he said, voice husky, not because of guilt, not because you saved me or anyone else, just because I love you. She blinked rapidly, then slowly nodded. Her fingers curled into his shirt, and she whispered one word against his collarbone, the first he had ever heard from her lips. Yes, a supremon. It came out like wind through pines, fragile but clear. Amaris are in mesterisawan. Their wedding was held 2 weeks later under the open sky. No church bells, no preacher in long robes, just a circuit rider from Abilene who carried a dog-eared Bible and believed love didn't need marble floors. The whole town came. They brought pies and fiddles, paper fans and wildflower garlands. Silas wore his best shirt, still patched at the elbow. Emmeline wore a white dress Mrs. Haverford had let out for her, with tiny embroidered roses along the hem. She walked to him barefoot. Luna led the way with a basket of petals. They stood beneath a cottonwood tree where Silas had once carved a small cross in memory of his brother. Today, it bore new initials, E+S. Below it, 2 joined horseshoes nailed side by side. I promise you, Silas said, voice steady as the earth, that I'll listen. Whether you speak or not, that I'll walk beside you, not in front or behind. Emmeline lifted her hands, spelling out words she knew he understood. Then she took a piece of slate from her pocket and showed it to him. We are both heard now. And the days after were golden and slow. Honeymoon wasn't a word they used, but the house felt different. Softer, warmer, one. Silas built her a proper writing desk by the front window. She planted a small herb garden near the back porch. Together, they taught Luna the names of stars and wildflowers. One late summer night, as cicadas sang from the tall grass, Emmeline stood on the porch in her nightgown, staring at the horizon. Silas joined her, wrapping a blanket around them both. I was thinking, he murmured, about how people say you were deaf. She leaned her head against his shoulder. But you heard everything, he whispered, more than most. She reached down, placed his hand on her belly, and held it there, a quiet moment. Then a tear slipped down her cheek. Guess you heard this one too. Smiling through the lump in his throat, and in the night air, with stars overhead and life beginning anew within them, they stood wrapped in silence that meant everything. As if when, the next spring, the baby was born a girl, with Emmeline's knowing eyes and Silas's steady hands. They named her Mercy. She grew up chasing butterflies and helping her mother collect chamomile. She heard lullabies, both sung and signed, and slept with her father's hand on her back. The barn never burned again. The town never forgot. And in the house near the bend in the road, under the cottonwoods, where the fence line met the sky, a man once broken and a girl once sold found not just love, but a place to belong, a home. Forever. Thank you for walking this journey with us, through the dust and desperation, to the quiet heart of the West. If the story of Silas and Emmeline has spoken to you, if you believe that the deepest love is not the one shouted from rooftops, but the one that is quietly understood, then we ask you to share their story. Please like this tale if you believe in second chances. Share it with someone who appreciates a love that is felt more than it is said. And subscribe to our channel for more stories from the Wild West, where legacies are forged, hearts are healed, And the truest connections are found in the most unexpected silences. Until next time, may you find someone who hears your heart